Declaration of Human Rights was created on October 24, 1945. It is the most universal human rights documentation in existence. This document breathes life into the many rights that we as humans know should belong to every person. However, the Government of Canada created an other in the minds of Canadians by marginalizing Indigenous people. Canada voted against human rights, specifically Indigenous rights, when the United Nations proposed the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of Indigenous People. This vote was due to the perception that Indigenous people are less human than European Canadians. This marginalization has manifested in the minds of all Canadians. Whether we like to admit it or not, there are several stereotypes that even you may associate with Indigenous people, such as the drunk Indian, welfare cheats, drain on the system, degenerates, as well as many others. Police and other authority figures are not immune to these beliefs.
Overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison is caused by over-policing and systemic racism, which all sprout from the ideas we hold in our minds. Even if we don't voice our prejudice, we are still attributing to discrimination.
We talked about overrepresentation in prison populations, and that can be attributed to over-policing and, I believe, systemic racism, and therefore overcharged, over-convicted, and over-represented in the prison population.
That image that we have in our minds causes us to treat people differently. Please don't investigate Indigenous cases with the same urgency because of these stereotypes that we hold in our mind.
People came to us in the community and said, I reported this to the police, they didn't look into it, it's not being investigated. So we had to get political will behind us to say, we need some help here. Could you, come and make sure that the police are doing what they need to be doing in terms of investigation? Because it took them 10 days before they started investigating my sister's case.
Time working in a women's shelter, I saw many women subjected to violence. Most often it was Indigenous women, and most times there was a period of adjustment because there was a severe lack of trust. The women that were brought into the shelter were incredibly resilient, strong women, but this lack of trust stems from their knowledge of the bias that others hold against them. They were hesitant to speak to other women in the shelter, as well as the shelter workers, because they were aware of the stigma surrounding Indigenous people and violence.
Indigenous people aren't the only group that are seen as the other. In Argentina, the lower class get targeted by the police authorities strictly because of their status and because of the perception that they are all drug addicts and alcoholics. Many disappearances and murders occur daily, however the amount of violence that takes place is hard to measure, seeing as how most of it is never discovered or is not reported. In First Contact, Trent, an Indigenous man from Calgary, has a reputation for violence. In his many encounters with the police, they have been very reactive towards him, solely because he is an Indigenous man. In this particular episode, Avon Lee, even though she had her own biases, spoke to him as though he was her equal. The more they spoke, the more Avon Lee realized that his anger came from a place of protection. Police in Argentina treat lower-class minorities in the same way that police treated Trent, reactively, based off of his outward appearance and the biases that they hold in their mind. I was born in Russia, and my parents lived there during the Soviet Union, which was a time of communism. If you didn't follow the rules, you were automatically shunned from society and seen as the other. My parents have told me many stories of a violent, controlling upbringing similar to the one in Argentina. Having heard these stories and comparing them to the life we live in Canada, I realize how lucky I am to live where I do.
Another group that has been seen as the other throughout history is women. Women were a marginalized group of society for many years. They were seen as inherently less than solely because they were biologically different than men. Women were most often seen as only being fit for the home, taking care of children, and doing household work. There was no place for a woman in the business sector or politics. Many countries still believe that women are inferior to men, such as Bangladesh, where women become victims of violence because they refuse the orders of their family. In Bangladesh, women have been subjected to acts of violence for many decades. The most popular form of this violence is acid violence, which is usually used in domestic disputes or refusal of marriage proposal. The purpose of the attacks is to disfigure the individual. therefore torturing them for the rest of their life as a constant reminder of the attack. In this situation, women are seen as the other because their rights are disregarded by those around them as well as the attacker. The perpetrator of the attack sees the woman as more of an object to own than as a human being. Attacks such as these have been going on for far too long, and authorities or government have little to no control over the situation, causing women to be singled out and seen as less than the rest of the population within Bangladesh. This is a common occurrence with groups that are seen as minorities because they are subjected to oppression. As a woman myself, and as many other women have, we have all been subjected to what can be seen as injustices. Although they may not be seen as the most severe form of injustice, they are still violations of someone's personal rights, such as catcalling. Many women have been catcalled while in public, including me. The amounts of times I've been walking down the street and have had someone roll down their window to whistle or yell at me is ridiculous. Many women and minorities have experienced something along these lines. But there is still hope. Women took matters into their own hands and demanded for their right to vote during the women's suffrage movement. And now, many other marginalized groups of societies have started to stand up and demand their rights as well. Harriet Martineau, a female sociologist of the 19th century, believed that social change should be found among the people themselves rather than within the ideologies of the government. Police officers are now taking diversity training more seriously in order to be educated on the negative effects of prejudices and discrimination. However, without looking inward and truly understanding the ways in which society has conditioned us to think a certain way about a certain group of people that are seen as the other, then we will never truly be able to fix the problem. We ask that you take a minute and think inward about the ways in which you classify certain people as the other, because we all do it. The times in which I say to myself the most is when I ride the C train. It's a split-second thought, and then I have to remind myself that this is my conditioning, and even though I'm not speaking out loud, these thoughts infringe upon the human rights of another. In order to truly change this view of the other, we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to acknowledge the ways in which we contribute, and we have to stand up and demand change.
Both my parents and I, at some point, have been treated like the other. We come from a different country and have strong accents that are hard to understand. I learned English quickly and lost my accent, but was still made fun of at school for the clothes I wore, the food I ate, and where I came from. However, my parents' accents did not disappear as quickly. The first job my mom got in Calgary was in Rona as a cashier, and there were a lot of rude customers. She didn't understand English very well at the time, and instead of helping her out, people would yell and complain at her. How do we create positive, effective, sustainable change when it comes to marginalizing certain groups of people and creating this other? By changing our mindset about how we view people that are different than us, by acknowledging when we contribute to marginalization, and by educating ourselves about different cultures and understanding that our differences are what make each of us a unique contributor to society.